Sustainable You is a casual, interactive, yet informative series detailing and cataloging the sustainability experience. Moreover, this is a short podcast docuseries detailing the thoughts and experiences of passionate advocates towards all things eco-friendly. Our journey is to know how and why understanding sustainable development towards the triple bottom line of people, profit, and planet can contribute to a more mindful, holistic, and inclusive world. Specifically, this podcast showcases what makes you a changemaker, innovator, and transformer as you tackle sustainability challenges for current and future generations to resolve the so-called wicked problems. So today I had a lively discourse with Dr. Emma Lawrance, an Australian neuroscientist based in the UK and a lead policy fellow for mental health at Imperial College London, whose research focuses on environmentalism and mental health. Dr. Lawrance is the Mental Health Innovations Fellow at the Institute of Global Health Innovation, in which he works in digital mental health support and climate change initiatives. For today's episode, we are particularly interested in learning more about climate anxiety, and in doing so, have a hearty dialogue on this emerging crisis. Stay tuned to be awed again by this unwavering eco-lution of knowledge. So just a quick intro, who you are and what you do.
Yeah, sure. So my name's Dr. Emma Lawrance and I lead the Climate Care Centre at Imperial College in London. And yeah, I get to work on the interconnections between climate change and mental health. And we work across research, but also policy and education and intervention design, and with people around the world.
I'm actually going to send you a list of words, and this is just to get to know you better. So you're going to choose one adjective from among the list that best describes your personal nature. And again, we don't mean to typecast your personality type as being A or B, but nothing like that. And you're like, a psychologist by trade. So, you can psychoanalyze much better than any of us can. But basically, it's to depict your persona in regards to your current vocation or callings.
Sure. I should clarify that even though I work in mental health research, I come from a neuroscience background, so I definitely don't have clinical kind of psychology skills. But okay, I've got the list now. Okay, let me read through this. And I just have to pick one of these words?
Yeah, just one would be good.
Oh, they're a great list. That's so tricky. I feel like there's like bits of, I have elements of the different ones in different contexts as well. I'm going to pick quirky. I think most people who know me well would say, yeah, I have a few quirks, and I tend to like hanging around also with people who are quite thoughtful and open-minded in the sense of, being willing to be silly, being willing to question things, being curious, and also, not wanting to let societal norms go unquestioned or get in the way of justice or fun. So yeah, I'm going to go with that, but it's a tricky one, and it's a great list.
Okay, great. That's the first one. I don't think we've gotten quirky yet. I guess you're right. There's a lot of overlap, so it is difficult to choose just one. But I think that's a good approach. Like, okay, thanks for that. And just in regards to that, actually, what makes you uncertain and what makes you curious?
Yeah, so uncertain. I am someone who both is often uncertain, but also has a history, I guess, of struggling sometimes with uncertainty. And I have a background in mental health from a research perspective, but also from a personal perspective, having experienced mental health challenges and mental illness in my life. And intolerance of uncertainty cuts across a lot of mental illnesses, and struggling with sort of the unknowns in the future. And I think that's something that I am learning to embrace more and more in my life. And also it came into my research. So my PhD research was looking at how we process different types of uncertainty in the brain and how it interacts with our decision-making and our tendency to experience anxiety, how that relates to the decisions that we make under uncertainty and the way we process that uncertainty in the brain, and missing information. And I think that really fed into also the work that I do in a climate context of understanding how we're grappling with the future that is getting in some ways more uncertain, certainly more risky for humanity. And but how we sit with that and don't switch off to it so that we can take action, because we have to be able to sit in a lot of uncomfortable emotions and uncertainties to be able to take action that ultimately will help create a better future. So that's on that. And I think curiosity, I'm naturally a very curious person. I think this is why I became a scientist, and I'm curious about so many aspects of the world, which is, I guess, partly why I've ended up in a space that is really about systems thinking and perspectives of connecting ideas, connecting people, trying to understand how we can bring together different disciplines, different cultures, to both understand, for instance, like the deep interconnections between the changing world and our mental health and well-being and the way that we're responding to it, but also, what that means in terms of how we drive solutions. But I definitely, my curiosity is seen as a plus in some contexts, and definitely, can also be for some people, my desire to question things, hasn't always been welcomed in every context. But it's definitely something I also enjoy when I get to work with people who are curious, and it's a pleasure to get to really bounce off each other in that way.
Interesting. And just to get to know you a little bit more, so tell me about you, your struggles, your aspirations, and contributions that I guess led you to get involved in climate change action through your research, of course.
Yeah, wow, these are big questions, great questions. I'm just trying to think about how to sort of answer that. I mean, I guess I've had struggles as with everyone, in different parts of my life. I mean, I'm very lucky to have grown up, with a wonderful, loving family and in a beautiful part of the world, on Ghana country in the Adelaide Hills in Australia. And that gave me an enormous privilege of being around nature a lot, or just not even sort of that experience of being separate from nature, but really feeling a part of it and its rhythms, and, being surrounded by trees and birds and koalas and all of those beautiful idyllic things, which also enabled me to, in terms of curiosity, to be curious about how all of this works and really develop a very deep love and connection for that land. But I have struggled throughout my life, as I said, from my teenage years with mental illness, and particularly kind of anxiety-related disorders, sometimes quite severely. And that was extremely difficult, and learning how to be at peace with my own mind is kind of an ongoing learning, and to manage my mental health. And I think one aspect of anxiety, among many, is sort of an existentialism, which I think also comes into when we're talking about climate anxiety. I think that sense of, that how do we come to terms with, who we are as individuals, as a species, and we come to terms with loss and death and impermanence. And, those things do really come in when we're kind of grappling with the loss of species and looking towards the future, and what it means to kind of know how bad the situation is when it comes to how, where we might be kind of blowing past tipping points that really will irreversibly and fundamentally change the world, and with catastrophic implications for the current life on Earth, including us. And how do you sit with that and in terms with that? So I think that factors into what I'm doing now. But it also experiencing severe mental illness came with a really strong appreciation of the importance of relationships, the importance of social health, the importance of what it means to have people there for you and to belong, and the importance of love in mental health. And it also gave me a deep empathy, I think, for the fact that you don't know what someone else is going through, and you can't kind of judge a book by its cover, because, I probably at the time, to many people, I was also, a top student doing all these things so well. And, I'm sure not everyone realized what my internal reality or personal life was like at the time in those difficult times. Yeah, in terms of struggle, I mean, yeah, there's lots of ups and downs, but in terms of my aspirations, yeah, I mean, I feel extremely lucky to get to do what I do now. I work with an amazing group of people around the world and in my team who share a deep love of people and the planet, and are really trying to work to support people and safeguard them from a changing climate, but also work with them to make sure that we can take action that will work towards a future that's healthier for us and for other species in the wider world. And yeah, I mean, my aspirations are definitely to try and enable in whatever ways I can action that makes a more equal world. And I think, a lot of the challenges that we have stem from massive inequalities, sort of a culture of extractivism of a certain small number of people, and in richer countries, taking sort of from everyone else, and particularly, global north to global south, but also even within countries. And, that is leading to draining all the resources, putting out all these emissions, and people, some people, even within countries like the UK, there's a lot of poverty, there's a lot of struggle, while there's certain people that are massively wealthy. So I see a desire to forge connection between people, connection between cultures, learn from cultures around the world who already have a lot of the solutions to how we can steward the earth, to live well with it, to thrive, and to create more equality and justice for us, and create a world where we act on the evidence of what we know is good for people and good for the world. And can we break some of the cycles we have now in the media and in culture and in power that is leading to kind of pretty catastrophic results at the moment. So yeah, fundamentally, climate action, climate justice, but towards a world where we can connect better to ourselves, to each other, to nature, in a way that fundamentally that everyone's better off. And I think on a more personal level, I have aspirations to be a mother, but that is complicated in the climate crisis as well.
No, that's really insightful. Thank you for sharing. And I guess just on that, what would be your most important personal satisfactions and dissatisfactions connected in the sustainability sector, especially towards climate action activism? So I guess what part of the job of being a mental health researcher do you personally find the most satisfying? What do you find the most challenging?
Yeah, I think, again, great questions. There's several things I find particularly satisfying. One is when I've seen a huge amount of progress over, the 6 years I've been working at the nexus of climate and mental health, of people coming into the space and people's awareness of the interconnectivity between some of the crises we're facing with the mental health crisis, the climate crisis, the poly crisis, but just to start to see that we can't address these issues in silos and how deeply connected things are. And that I got to work on a project called Connecting Climate Minds with over 1,000 people across over 100 countries coming together through dialogue to create a shared vision, what the priorities are for research and action on climate and mental health, and to really listen to and learn from different people, different cultures, different disciplines. I get a lot of satisfaction from seeing how the awareness is being raised in many different policy contexts in the UK and internationally and in different fields, but also getting to learn from what's happening as well around the world. And so fundamentally it's about connecting people, connecting ideas. Like I said, I feel really privileged when I get to be in the room where it happens, as it were, with some of the kind of multilateral discussions, in whether it's at COP conferences or at high-level research conferences or things like that, where you have people coming together really passionate and really, the climate and health community is such a passionate community. And so I get a lot of energy and satisfaction from that. I think the challenges are it's working in an area where we constantly are also taking on a lot of distress and listening to a lot of stories that are really, really challenging, of the suffering that's coming from the climate crisis already around the world. And, and there's a lot. And also, so hearing that and trying to grapple with the facts, when you read the science of just how bad the situation is and how urgent the action is, and then you see the gap sometimes with, what narratives are in the media and in politics. And you read a story of how much money Shell's made or a fossil fuel company has made, while, on the same time, you're hearing about people not being able to heat their homes, having to choose in the UK between heating their homes or eating, and these massive inequalities and just the blatant disregard of corporations and politics and the media that's driving kind of national conversations. And that can be really challenging when you see often the blame for what's happening, like the cost of living or whatever, not being pointed at the companies that are polluting the world and causing droughts and floods and driving up food prices as agriculture fails. Obviously, that's one part of a complex picture, but it is part of the picture. But getting blamed on, I don't know, something like immigration or something that's really irrelevant to what's actually going on. So I think that can be a challenge. And also just fundamentally the difference you see between the need. We get asked all the time for resources, for workshops, for support for people working in the field, people wanting more research, more policymakers or the World Bank, or people saying, we need more evidence, we need more data on this, we need. And there's a lot of need, but there's no funding at the moment for this work. And it's really difficult to be trying to get together really tiny amounts of money to then stretch to how many people can we help? What work can we do with the resources that we have? So those are some of the challenges. But getting to work with really passionate people, getting to see where solutions are happening around the world, amazing work. And just to see the examples where they've got it right and where, for instance, in Victoria and Australia, a fairly small investment in home efficiency upgrades led to lower emissions, higher quality of life, higher mental health for the people involved in the work. And you can just see that actually when we act on the sources of issues, we get all of these benefits coming at once, and that it really is possible to start to get those positive tipping points happening.
Yeah, interesting. No, it's really insightful. And I guess just on that, what motivates you to continue in this field and pursue this initiative or calling? Because for me personally, when I worked in mainstream media, I would just see, this old indestructive narrative around climate change and, the fact that we're living in a very damage control society. And I can't even imagine what it's actually like to be, in the thick of the field itself. And I know some people have mentioned working in the sector, they get a lot of burnout. What motivates you to keep going in this direction?
Yeah, it's a great question. And burnout is really a challenge for people working in anything to do with sort of climate and environment related careers or touching on that, or for people who just care in general in the population who are taking action. And, we see a lot of burnout of young activists, etc. as well. And, we've had members of, organisations like the Met Office in the UK, BBC journalists, climate change committee members sort of saying this is really taking a toll on our mental health of doing this work. And we feel that in our team. I've felt that, and our team has felt that, especially when the risk factors are right. Like, as you said, the challenge of seeing the gap between what needs to happen and what's actually happening, and, the effort to try and change and maybe feeling like it's not changing or not changing fast enough. But also it's really hard, I think, for a lot of people to step back because there's that strong sense of urgency and there's a strong emotional connection to the work. And in some fields that there isn't space for that. So I'm very lucky that, in my team, we can talk about that. But for some people, they're grappling with this, but they're maybe in fields or in spaces where it doesn't, in science, sometimes it's seen as maybe inappropriate to discuss the more personal aspects or the emotional aspects because you're meant to be, quote unquote, sort of objective. But it's, that emotion is, of course, there, and we're humans. And if you're documenting, the reefs dying or, it's very emotional. So, so to say that is there and those risks are there. But I guess I'm learning a lot from the people that we work with in the mental health part of the climate and sort of mental health space of also how we care for each other and care for ourselves. And for instance, I was at a retreat last year that was also with Christiana Figueres, who was sort of one of the architects of the Paris Agreement. there's a real focus on community and connection again, and supporting each other, and spaces for us to share in circles like what we were feeling and experiencing, but also sort of meditative mindfulness practices. This was actually at a Buddhist monastery. But a lot of those, it wasn't just for Buddhists or inherently Buddhist. A lot of the teachings are really about, how do we again see the deep interconnectedness, and what does that mean by the actions that we take and how we show up, not just what we do, but how we do it, that can really make a difference as well. Like when we're able to show up, bringing our whole selves to a space, and we're able to make space for the different emotional responses we might hold at once, like anger and hope and grief and fear and determination and all sorts of things together, but also creating space for joy, and creating space that there can be ripple effects of that, and that because we're so interconnected, that how we show up, we might not see it immediately, but there's this sort of idea of the ripening, and how over time, when we give things time and space, and our actions can have these and do have these ripple effects. And so what we do does matter, and how we show up does matter, but that it's also, not all on any one of our shoulders. And how do you sort of create some space for that grace to ourselves as well, and some sort of acceptance, I guess, as well, in a deep way, like acceptance of what is, as well as like striving to make things better. And it's an ongoing process, I think. But yeah, I think what keeps me going is, fundamentally, I really love the people I get to work with. A lot of the work, not every part of every job is ideal, but a lot of the work that I do is really satisfying, because we're seeing the engagement, getting to see the possibilities for change. I've definitely had periods where I've struggled to step away from work, and it's still ongoing, but trying to really make space for time with family, time in nature, exercise, all those things. Really obviously make a big difference as well. And just making space for that joy, and the celebrating the successes, and also just celebrating still what is. And like, it can be sometimes hard to when we see destruction and things not as we want, to also like focus so much on that we don't also celebrate like what's good in our teams and in our lives. And that it's important to make space for that as well.
Hey, yeah, no, I think that what you mentioned, I totally agree with that whole aspect of mindfulness, maybe even living a more minimalist lifestyle is very critical. And again, it goes back to, maybe even giving a sense of agency to those maybe that are marginalized and face environmental injustices as well. So I think that's a very valid point. And just to go on to the next question, what would you say are core values and intent within your research practices? Is there some sort of basic philosophy, I guess, you adhere to?
Yeah, as a team, we've been strategizing about something we call, so I lead the Climate Care Centre, and we've been strategizing about something called living climate cares. Like, what does it look like to live out our values? And I think there's a few aspects to that. One is, to the point we just raised, is how do we make sure that our health and well-being, and the health and well-being of people that we work with, isn't negatively affected by the work that we're doing? And how do we make sure that, because it's sometimes ironic, like in my work in mental health, that you can be maybe you're helping others, but your own mental health is suffering, and to a point where, you're going to burn out, and that's not sustainable, and ultimately then not helpful. So how are we showing up? How are we doing the work in that sense? And also, how are we making sure that our work doesn't negatively affect the environment and other people around the world? And that is a challenge when you're doing research and policy work and convening and connecting work and field building work that really is about connecting people, because we can do a lot online, but sometimes there is value of kind of being in the room, like I said, where things happen, and at these kind of policy fora, and just meeting with people on the ground and seeing what's happening in different spaces. And so I do, in my personal life, apart from visiting my family in Australia, which is obviously a massive amount of carbon, but I've been, trying to, I guess, cut back on, not doing personal kind of flights to just, go on holiday in Europe or something like that for most of my life. Certainly the whole time I've lived in the UK for the last 12 years or so, I've really tried to avoid that as much as possible, or as much as, I've done it occasionally, but I've been conscious of trying to reduce. But for work, I've ended up traveling quite a lot. And so, yeah, we're always trying to work out, how do you make those decisions around when it's valuable, and like you're sort of kind of comparing apples and oranges. So we have at Imperial College London, there's a grant from Institute for Climate Change and the Environment, and there's led by some climate scientists. There's a really good, a lot of carbon offsetting organizations are kind of rubbish and can even be like actively harmful rather than helpful. But we work with an organization that is really good and is actually making an impact. So we try and do things like that, and, catch trains to conferences whenever possible rather than flying, things like that, to live out our values there. And also around decolonizing approaches. So we're very aware that, we're working out of the UK. Obviously, there's a massive history of colonization, of trauma inflicted on, communities around the world, and of extractivism, of kind of going in and taking data, people, resources. And we definitely don't want to do that in our research. So trying to always work with communities, with people with lived experience, to do co-production, to be led by and try and give platforms and opportunities to other people rather than always for ourselves. So yeah, we really try and foster ways of like learning from each other across global north, global south, across different cultures, people with different lived experiences. Yeah, rather than kind of perpetuating those processes and making sure communities who take part in research ultimately benefit from it, or else it can, sort of perpetuate that extractivism.
Okay, great. And just for this next one, what would be your personal definition of sustainable development and sustainability? So how do you view sustainability, especially within the context of climate change advocacy? And is there a particular SDG you best advocate for? And just the second part of this question, do you find that metrics like the SDG still hold merit?
Wow, a lot to unpack there. Good question. I'm not sure if I have the best definition, but it's something I'd really have to think about. I think, to me, sustainability and development, again, I would want it to be led by the communities and the people and the countries, rather than being some sort of just like recipient of aid, as it were. That those communities and those countries know best what they need, and so that there is that we're being led by people who know what's best for them and their communities in sustainable development. I guess, making sure. I think there's an argument, or there's arguments that I've definitely hear that, climate action is at odds with like economic growth and prosperity and it's sort of unfair to people who, won't have the same quality of life in these countries. And I think it is a challenge, of course, but there is, how do we chart those pathways where, well, first of all, like the rich and developed nations are paying their fair share of support for the countries that will need to develop, like kind of leapfrogging some of the fossil fuel technologies that are used in rich countries and going to other renewable approaches. But that also gives a lot of opportunities to develop in a way that will ultimately benefit the health of those populations, because, we know, for instance, burning fossil fuels, 7 million people die a year from breathing in polluted air, and 7 million is a lot of people. And air pollution affects every organ in our body, including our brain, including our mental health. Like, people who are breathing polluted air are more likely to have anxiety, depression, schizophrenia, neurodevelopmental disorders, and dementia. And so I think these things are sometimes put at odds, but there is huge risks for, like, a lot of the burden of climate hazards and climate impacts is already being felt in countries in the global south who have contributed the least to the problem. And that's going to only get worse. And so it's irresponsible to ignore that in sort of chasing economic growth and prosperity and saying that's the best way, because, these impacts are real and they're only getting worse. And there is an alternative way to take action that would reduce those climate risks while also creating systems that are healthier for people and planet. So to me, sustainability, I guess, is around how do we create systems and build on cultures that are already happening, that we're kind of working with working with what works locally, working with the natural systems, working, like, considering that systems view, considering how our health, our society, our economy, the natural environment is all interconnected, and how do we support them all to kind of thrive together.
Okay, yeah, no, it's a very insightful perspective.
On the I was gonna say on the SDGs. So yeah, I think again, I just see them as deeply interconnected as well. Like, it's great to have all these sort of separate goals, but they're so interconnected, and mental health is so cross-cutting across all of them as well. Like, we hear in the climate crisis, it's not just like, okay, you experience a hot day or experience a fire, which obviously can be really terrible in and of itself. And, you know, seeing wildfires again in California and these disasters around the world. And those have huge immediate impacts on people's lives, livelihoods, health. It also can have long-lasting traumatic impacts. But there's then a flow-on effect on, like, people's access to healthcare and education, and sometimes being forced from their homes, and, you know, not being able to grow food, having water insecurity, having economic hardships, having more violence. There's all sorts of things that flow from that. And these climate hazards sort of destabilize the conditions we know, the social and economic determinants, the things that we know that are good for mental health and well-being. And yeah, so I see that, you know, mental health is kind of really cross-cutting with the SDGs. And so, yeah, we need to kind of tackle these things together, or when we start tackling them, like mental health benefits as well, I guess.
Okay, yeah, no, it's definitely interesting to hear your take on that. And for me, in grad school, we had learned that the SDGs, like at least in Sweden, I noticed it might just be the way they think of it, but they were bashing on the SDGs, and they, from their perspective, and I get it now, you know, very much like the SDGs very much have to do with the Anthropocene. And it's not really inclusive. It doesn't take that, again, that biocentric or ecocentric perspective where, you know, you consider all flora and fauna. Whereas when I was, you know, here in Calgary, or at least here in Alberta, it's something we follow a bit more closely. And again, like what you were mentioning, like the term itself, like sustainable development, if you think about it, it's like a paradox. It doesn't really, you know, it kind of conflicts in and of itself. And then, of course, you have things like degrowth. But I think all of this does somehow tie into mental health, and I don't think there's not enough dialogue on that. Okay, great. Thanks for giving your perspective on that. So just on this next question, so for those of you unaware out there, how does climate change, pollution, and waste in our world affect us both globally and locally, and our lifestyle on a personal level? So I would love to hear your perspective on that. And how did you first get involved in this endeavor, I guess, of environmentalism, climate change action, and mental health?
Yeah, sure. So as a sort of summary of how the climate and environmental crises are affecting people's mental health, there's a variety of very interconnected and kind of compounding pathways. The first is, so if we think of the sort of most direct effects, so people experiencing higher temperatures, more heat waves, and just rising global temperatures. When temperature varies from like a local norm, and there's more variation and more rapid changes that are happening, changing climate and seeing more extreme heat, that variation and those extremes are associated with a range of poor mental health outcomes. Like, we see, sadly, more deaths by suicide on hotter days. We see more people during heat waves going to hospitals with symptoms of mental illness. In a meta-analysis we did, it's 10% higher, for instance. We see that, sadly, more people living with mental health conditions die in the context of heat waves. So when the heat dome hit in Canada a few years ago, sadly, about 8%, I believe, of the people who died were diagnosed with schizophrenia, which is much higher than the percentage of people who live with schizophrenia. And so, you know, and we see that across the population as well. You know, we might not sleep as well. We can't think as well. We don't work as well. We're more irritable. There can be more violence with the more heat, but then also more extreme weather and climate events. So whether it's floods, droughts, wildfires, rising sea levels, glacial melt, all sorts of things lead to potentially losing loved ones, as well as, potentially losing our own lives, but losing loved ones, losing homes, experiencing traumas and stresses that can go on to lead to more people developing like post-traumatic stress, anxiety, depression, substance misuse, etc. But then, as I said, there's sort of this compounding impacts where it's because they're happening more frequently now. It's not just the one time, because we can also, of course, see people rebuilding, we can see resilience, but being hit time and time again can really wear that down and make it hard for people to recover before the next thing hits. And it also gives people a lot of uncertainty. When do I move? When, can I stay here? How am I going to support my family into the future? What does life look like into the future? And those economic stresses, the stresses on farmers, on the cultures being interrupted of Indigenous communities and peoples around the world. We're seeing kids not being able to go to school because it's too hot, or there's been a flood, or all sorts of reasons, or because there's too much air pollution even, and there's the same kind of cause of polluted air as climate related greenhouse gas kind of pollution, but burning fossil fuels. But also we see that the air pollution worsens with rising temperatures, rising humidity, and so there's this vicious kind of cycle. And those things are really disrupting the conditions for people to thrive and undermining what we know is good for mental health and leading to worse mental health outcomes as well. And then there's like how all of this interacts with awareness of, like I said, of just, not just this is my experience now, but how do we process what's happening and how do we process what's happening into the future? And people have a whole range of psychological responses. I mean, some people shut down, some people want to deny it, some people might feel angry or guilty or sad or fearful or all those things at once. And people respond differently in how it affects them in their thoughts, their feelings, their actions. But what we find is that people who are already experiencing or see themselves as experiencing more climate impacts are more likely to have things like higher eco-anxiety, to be more likely to be grappling with this, to be more likely to be making different decisions for their futures, even around things like, whether or not they're scared to have children when we survey young people. And it's the people who are living with the challenges that are most scared and stressed for the future. It's not just like, white people in rich countries or something. And so all of these effects can interact. And at the same time, we see that climate action and acting with others and having strong social bonds can protect us from some of these impacts and help us cope, but also can help us, take action as communities to protect our communities and whether that's through planting drought-resistant crops, through more tree cover, through more active travel, through, putting solar panels on our school, whatever it is. But those things can really help mental health and fundamentally at a more systems level, when we're taking action as a society to, reduce fossil fuels, we'll have cleaner air. Every organ in our body will thank us. When we have more tree cover, when we have more equal societies, well-being goes up and emissions go down. So there's huge benefits to be gained when we start taking action as individuals and when we push fundamentally governments and businesses to take action.
Okay, great. It's interesting to kind of hear about these different diverse amount of social problems that you have to deal with. And just on this next question, so just for our listeners out there who might be newbies and maybe they're hearing about climate anxiety for the first time, so what is exactly climate anxiety? What is it all about? What is its origins? Did it come with the onset of the modern environmentalism movement in the 1970s? It would be nice to get your definition of eco-anxiety. And I know you explained a little bit about it, but I guess just to go a bit more in depth of how it affects mental health and why the reason is it's becoming more commonplace in our era, especially with these recent and up-and-coming younger generations.
Yeah, so things like, you just even in the question said climate anxiety and then eco-anxiety, and people are often using a variety of terms, kind of colloquially, fairly interchangeably. And even within the research field, there's been a variety of kind of scales to see, how do we measure, what are the different experiences of people when it comes to climate distress, climate worry, climate anxiety, eco-anxiety. And, there's quite a lot of overlap, and we're still really trying to unpack what are really evolving experiences and quite nuanced and complicated experiences within each of us as we're grappling with the realities of the climate crisis. So often, anxiety is in the title of something like climate anxiety. Just, from a research perspective, we sort of say climate anxiety is maybe more specific to climate, whereas eco-anxiety might be encompassing also all of the other connected environmental challenges like the biodiversity crisis and pollution like you were discussing. But even though that there's anxiety in the title, people generally use it as a way to share a whole range of things they might be experiencing. So very strong emotional responses. Like I said, that could include like sometimes feeling despair or being very afraid, being very angry, a whole range of strong emotional responses. But also, that cognitive element of thinking a lot about it, of really worrying, and how that shows up in our effects on our work, our sleep, and also physiologically. Like, do people feel like, can they feel changes in their body, or it's anxiety related or other things? So there's different aspects to how we might be affected in our thoughts and our feelings and our bodily sensations and our behavior when we're thinking about the climate crisis or we're experiencing it, and that interactions with our awareness of it, and not just our awareness of that, but our awareness of insufficient action. And so in terms of, why this is happening and also how it relates to mental health, I mean, one thing just to be very clear on is that it's not a mental health condition to be feeling very strongly and being affected in this way by awareness of the climate crisis. Like, it's a very understandable, even potentially adaptive, healthy thing to be. Anxiety has also evolved to try to prime us for action towards threats. And this is a massive threat. And it can drive people to action. But we also need healthy ways to process it and to take action that is sustainable for us, and to kind of process those strong emotions. And if it's becoming at a point where those experiences are interfering with people's well-being and people's daily life and function, then you might need more support and more like mental health related support. And we do see that those experiences of climate distress seem to be, that they can have impacts on mental well-being, they can have impacts on insomnia, they can have impacts on psychological health. So there's probably interactions as well where people who maybe more have a tendency to think about these things, to engage with information, maybe a tendency to be more anxious in general may feel that more strongly. But when we surveyed young people in the UK, we found that like with the distress around COVID scaled strongly with a tendency to experience anxiety in general, but that scaled way less strongly for climate distress. So even people who didn't have a tendency to experience anxiety were significantly more distressed about climate than COVID, even in the middle of 2020 in the UK. And so why this is happening? I mean, I think it's just we're all becoming more aware of the climate crisis because we're seeing the effects more and more. And it's just very, very serious. The longer that, there are shifts, and there's exciting shifts towards renewable energy, and towards like cultures where people are doing a lot of regeneration, of stewardship of lands, new ways of doing agriculture, or new ways of creating circular economies, all sorts of things, both new and old, are happening. And there's a lot of exciting progress, but we see that because there hasn't been sufficient action in the past, and to date, some people actively pushing against that who have entrenched interests in the business as usual, that can also be very distressing, understandably. And again, it's all very understandable, but there's a big element also for people who we talk to in the global south of just that sense of anger and understandable like injustice, and that's sort of across generations as well. Young people are dealing with this the most, but they've contributed the least, and often they feel very misunderstood and not heard by necessarily the generations around them. But this happens across generations. It's not just young people, or not just a certain demographic who's feeling this, but definitely people who are more aware, who are more engaged, understandably feel it more. People who are already experiencing these impacts of the climate crisis, people who are the ones who are experiencing the most but contributed the least. Like these are people who are particularly affected. So I think there is this misperception that climate anxiety is just people who are worried about the future or who don't have other things to worry about, but that's not what we see in the data.
Interesting. How exactly does a deteriorating natural environment affect one's mental health? Like, what would be, I guess, like the trigger warnings for eco-anxiety? So for me personally, if I have to give an example, as I'd mentioned earlier, I'm from Alberta, which is like the oil and gas province capital of Canada, and they tend to do a lot of fracking, and it's kind of in tandem. I would say it's kind of like related to that, but there's always this kind of this like, this I guess this fear that the land is becoming drier and like desertification might happen, and it's getting like we notice that too here. I guess for everyone it's different, but if I were to talk to some, because I have even some friends that don't really seem to care all that much, I guess it's just the apathy behind that. But some are very woke and they're really into like, they follow everything on like climate action. So is there, I guess like what would be your perspective on that? Because I guess not all of us have those warnings. I guess I'm just the black sheep when I'm like, no, this is wrong. It shouldn't be like this, like the industry, but here.
And when we talk about things like climate anxiety and that range of psychological responses, I was saying before, some people do feel apathetic or do feel, I think sometimes it's just also, it's too hard, it's too scary to think about. It's a defense mechanism as well to kind of think, oh, it must be okay, or, surely it's not that bad, or like, there's psychological defense mechanisms as well to try and keep us safe in sort of an unsafe climate, and to be like, I don't want to engage with that. I don't have the mental, emotional resources to engage with that. Or I, understandably want to believe everything's kind of fine. And that's really understandable as well. And, but the challenge, the frustrating thing for me is that people will really be affected. And so it's really difficult when you see like people saying, but, all I care about is XYZ, when often XYZ will be, it is under threat by the actions of people who are kind of by the companies and the governments who are saying, oh, no, like look away, it's all fine, we've got you, like blame these people over here, blame the immigrants or the tree huggers or whatever it is, while we can kind of continue to bulldoze over your future and take massive profits in doing so. And so, that's really frustrating and upsetting. But what is the difference and why do some people are affected, not others? I think we're still sort of untangling this, but there's definitely relationships with our political persuasions or our core like values and beliefs, like the narratives that we hear and that we're told around the climate crisis. Maybe the psychological resources we have to sort of really engage with it. Sometimes it's tricky. Some data sets, it seems like things like gender or age may play a role, but in others maybe less so. So it's still don't know entirely, and within the same family or the same group, we know people will come out and engage in different ways. So I basically to say I don't have all of the answers, and there is a lot of research coming out very, very quickly, and some people might be working all this out, but there is a lot of people also with a lot of money, like the fossil fuel companies, who've spent trillions trying to push the narrative a certain way, right? They've created individual carbon calculators so that people blame each other and finger point at each other or feel guilty themselves. Like young people in the UK felt more guilty about climate change than COVID, even though they felt less like they could do something about it. So there's a lot of that, like pushing it back on the individual as opposed to pushing on the people who are profiting off ruining the futures of others. And so I think there's, it's understandable as well that like that sort of finger pointing, it's happening because there's been a lot of money spent on telling people it doesn't matter or to look away or like to blame others or to, that engaging with it is woke, like that, which is fundamentally a bit ridiculous that it's kind of seen as a niche interest to care about having a planet that humans can live on. But it's so ridiculous, but it's also, sadly like the case that people have spent a lot on that. So, I don't know if that fully answers the question. I mean, one thing I just wanted to say was like seeing environmental degradation is the idea of solastalgia and like sort of feeling this word that was coined by Glenn Albrecht, a Australian philosopher, and this idea of sort of putting solace and nostalgia together, and that when we lose that sense of solace that would usually come from being in our home, and when we see it changing in ways that make it unrecognizable or because of environmental destruction.
So what is like, I guess, the so-called resistance to change that we're witnessing, this phenomenon when it comes to the fear of the unknown, when it comes to climate disasters? And you mentioned the apathy, but how, I guess, do we transition our mindset from being more resistant to, of course, being more resilient? So again, not that old and destructive narrative, all the doom scrolling and the malevolence of climate change apocalypse, but to move to something where, I guess, embracing it more as inevitable and, I guess, adopting to this new normal or reality. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. So fatalism and doomism really plays into the hands of people who just want the status quo to continue, because ultimately both denialism and doomism or fatalism both lead to the same thing, which is inaction now. And the thing is, it's not black and white. This is not a like we win or we lose. Like, there are tipping points, and so that means we need action as fast as possible so that we don't kind of trigger irreversible or runaway changes in the Earth systems. But also, no matter what happens, there's going to be, we can make this better or worse. There's always a better path to be pushing for. There's always people's and other species' lives and that can be saved or not. So there's always action to take, and so that and there's already action happening, and there's a lot of things to celebrate and uplift and join and become a part of as well. And so that doomism and fatalism is really a narrative that kind of plays into the wrong hands, as it were. But at the same time, it's it's understandable, and sometimes to also have grace with ourselves if we just feel like that and feel overwhelmed, and reaching a point of being able to hold space for what is and the emotions that kind of come with that, as well as like that what is that future that we desire. And Joanna Macy talks about sort of active hope in the work that reconnects, and that hope isn't just passive. We don't need to wait for everything to sort of seem like it'll be okay to feel hopeful, that we can create hope through our actions and what is it that we're working towards, what we hope for. And because the future isn't here yet, right? There is uncertainty in that, and we can be, what we do now does, and how we show up now, what we do now does, will be part of that. And but also that we this is a collective endeavor, and that it's not just on any one of our shoulders, but join with others. I think it's Bill McKibben or something says the best thing you can do in the climate crisis as an individual is like not act like an individual. And also, think about where, I guess one action that is, where are we putting our money as individuals and organizations as well? Are we putting our resources and energy into the things that we want to be contributing to, or are we putting them into fossil fuels, even indirectly through our superannuation or our bank accounts, our business accounts, our organizational things? So there's lots of things that we can do that collectively really do add up.
Okay, great. And when it comes to corporate sustainability and things like crisis communication, do you have any thoughts on that, especially with the widespread increase we've been seeing with global warming and natural disasters?
Yeah, I mean, one thing is just corporate accountability. So creating space for people to express how they're feeling, what they see the organization to value, but also telling the truth as an organization about the impacts they're having on the environment and the climate, and what they're going to do about it. And not greenwashing, but kind of truth telling, and supporting and championing the people who are working in sustainability and supporting their mental health and doing a really difficult job.
I read this a bit through your article, but again, not to typecast, but what would you say is the biggest difference you notice in terms of climate change advocacy, I guess, within the generational divide of boomers, Gen X, millennials, Gen Z, and now Gen Alpha and Omega? And again, how do we advocate for those who are underrepresented, overlooked, and marginalized, as all these different groups tend to be not just youth, but of course women, elderly, the indigenous, refugees, LGBTQIA, 2S. So I guess this is a question really just centers around, the generational divide and social impact.
Yeah, I mean, so there are lots of incredible activists from, like you said, who are women or in marginalized ethnicities. But what we see, for example, in the UK is a lot of the people who are being involved in what we might think of as kind of climate activism, of kind of taking to the streets or taking civil disobedience, are sometimes the older people, or sometimes the very young, who sometimes don't have kids or don't have in some ways the luxury of being able to do that without maybe more brutality at the hands of the police or without, being deported. So it's great that people who have those privileges are sort of putting themselves out there to do that and advocating for everyone. But yeah, there definitely needs to be more opportunity to raise up the voices of the people who are most affected and who are doing great work and taking great action already. And not just the same people over and over from, the one person from this country or the one person from this group, but how do we go and listen to the stories of lots of different people? And we tried to really do that through Connecting Climate Minds. But yeah, across, we see a lot of young people obviously taking action, but there are people taking action in all sorts of ways, people who are parents who really care about their kids' future. There are amazing people around the world taking action, but there certainly needs to be more support for people who are doing that to not burn out. And that's what we're also trying to do with providing the right mental health support.
Okay, perfect. Okay, great. Thank you so much again for partaking in Sustainable You.
Okay, perfect. Okay, thanks so much. Have a good day.
Thanks so much for tuning in to yet another eye-opening episode of Sustainable You. Again, this is an extraordinary and engaging info series whose purpose is to make sustainable development and sustainability accessible to the average person in their quest to quench their knowledge on environmentalism. Be sure to leave your feedback by liking this week's released edition and by subscribing to this podcast. Again, any love from our followers is much appreciated. Signing off until next time.